The focus on the Quran has returned over and over to me throughout my life. I first began to think about this topic around 12 years old. You see, my mom really enjoyed listening to Islamic lectures on CDs while driving, and I happened to be in the car and partially listening to this lecture when I realized that the Imam was quoting more hadiths or references to Prophet Muhammad's life than the actual Quran. And I was confused and curious, a little bit annoyed. I remember saying to myself in that moment, why are hadiths being used more than the actual words of God? So after that realization, I started to think about the teachings I received as a child who attended Islamic school during my primary years and teachings that I received from my family. And I was mad that I knew more insignificant details about women's skirts lengths rather than having read the entire Quran in my youth, especially attending an Islamic school. I was kind of angry because why did memorizing the Quran without knowing its meaning more important than actually reading the entirety of the Quran and understanding it? So for some of the chapters of the Quran that I had memorized since I was a child, I had no idea what they meant for most of my life. And why was that acceptable? I personally felt made to ignore God's words in favor of a record of the way it was applied, a record that was written down between 100 to 200 years after the fact. The proper response is not to abandon hadith, but to realize that it is the Quran that we must follow as our guide in life and use hadith as a helper where needed, a helper towards following the Quran. And God in the Quran reminds us of whose words could be better than the words of God in chapter 4, verse 122. Those who attain to faith and do righteous deeds, God shall bring into gardens through which running waters flow, to abide beyond the count of time. This, in truth, is God's promise, and whose words could be truer than God's? God also reminds us in chapter 31, verse 27, if all the trees on earth were pens, and the sea was ink, with 7 more seas added to it, the words of God would not be exhausted, for God is almighty, wise. So the Quran is like an ocean into which we plunge, but whose depths can never be reached. So how can we run out of God's words when discussing our faith? So sometime after that, I too no longer felt that I could relate to Islam any longer. I had no idea what was in the Quran. I felt that I spent most of my life learning insignificant details, and I just couldn't find myself. Sometime later, I was searching for religious comfort, and I decided that I would read the Quran in its entirety. I listened to each verse, first in Arabic, then in English translation after that, because I can't understand Quranic Arabic. I highlighted and made notes throughout of verses that spoke to me, such as chapter 10, verse 57. Humankind, there has come to you instructions from your Lord, this Quran, and healing for what is in the hearts, and guidance and mercy for the believers. I eventually came to believe that Qur'an-focused Islam is not rules-based, but ideals-based. I began to explore the idea of my own Islam, meaning what is the Qur'an trying to tell me personally? How do I understand this verse? How can I apply this verse to my life and daily practices? Because regardless of what year we are in, we can always go back to the Quran, treating it as if it was revealed right at this time, as if everything it says is still relevant in this moment. This means that as times change, interpretations can change, because the meaning can be updated daily as new knowledge and ideas arrive and are exposed to the Quran. So for example, the Quran mentions the Big Bang Theory. The Quran mentions that the heavens and earth were meshed together tight and compact, aka the Big Bang, by stating in chapter 21, verse 30, are they who are bent on denying the truth not aware that the heavens and earth were once one single entity, which God then parted asunder, and that God made out of water every living thing? Will they not then begin to believe? Then after the Big Bang, we know that the universe was primarily made of hydrogen, helium, and lithium, which made the universe this opaque, non-transparent, like smoke. And God has also said this in the Quran, chapter 41, verse 11, and it is God who applied God's designs to the sky, which were yet but smoke, and it is God who said to them and to the earth, come into being, both of you, willingly or unwillingly. To which both responded, we do come in obedience. So in this way, the Quran does not lead to an Islam that's out of date. It leads to an Islam that is made up of Quran logic applied to the modern world. It stands up to all of its challenges, rejects its falsehoods, and adopts the good in it. And in this way, Islamic thinking can change while always staying true and authentic to the words of God in the Quran. So after reading the Quran for its entirety and for the first time, I wanted to feel more in charge of my faith, and I wanted to understand what my faith meant to me. And I wanted to develop my own faith practice, and I wanted this to be a Quran-led practice. So through the questions I was asking myself, I knew I was looking to make Islam more meaningful and personal to myself. I wanted to feel connected to God alone and not through someone else. I wanted to remove the barriers between myself and God. I was looking for the Quran's wisdom. This is when I began to explore the idea of translating the Quran for myself. And by translating the Quran, I mean creating your own version alongside the translated works you're reading, and not a word-by-word translation. As scholar Dr. Amina Wadood says, the process of reviewing the words and their context in order to derive a meaning of the text. And I don't pretend to call myself a scholar, Islamic teacher, or even know classical Arabic, but I didn't want that to stop me from connecting directly to the words of God. I can read the Quran and connect to the feelings I have while I'm reading the words of God. And today I want to share some of my own personal practices with translating the Quran for yourself. But first, I do want to take a step back and address what may seem like a Hadith versus Quran argument. Because a person hearing this may think that this way of thinking rejects Hadith or considers it unimportant. I can continue to respect Hadith and the classical scholarly tradition. All I want to do is recognize the Quran's high status compared to Hadith and the crucial differences between the role of the Quran compared to the role of Hadith. And Hadith is not a competitor to the Quran or equal authority to it. Hadith only tells us about the Prophet's efforts in following the Quran's guidance. Aisha, the Prophet Muhammad's wife, was asked to describe the character of the Prophet, and her answer was his character was the Quran. So Islamic belief and practice is entirely about following the Quran. Hadith is there to help us towards this goal. It is not there to give us new goals, to add new things to Islam, to create a companion religion to the religion of the Quran that also has to be followed. And I do want to mention the importance of Quranic tafsir or commentary. This information is helpful to understand when and why a certain verse was sent down from God at that particular moment. Without this information, we may not be able to understand why God has chosen to send this message down. Fazlur Rahman, whom I will speak about in a moment, introduces his book stating that tafsir is available for each verse of the Quran, but they are of no help to a student seeking to acquaint themselves with what the Quran has to say about God, humans, or society. And I believe he's right because it gives me more of a history of the verse, but it doesn't help me feel connected to the words of God. So returning back to my point of tackling the Quran for myself, I'm going to first address how the Quran is structured. So the Quran has 114 chapters or surahs in Arabic, and it's not arranged chronologically or thematically. Even within the individual chapters, numerous topics can be covered from switch it back and forth. And the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years and not in sequential order. Many verses were revealed on the spot as a response to unexpected questions and challenges that were brought forward to Prophet Muhammad from both believers and non-believers. And then each chapter of the Quran has a name, and the name is derived from a significant word from the chapter. Verses, or ayahs in Arabic, literally translates into signs. So by understanding how the Quran is structured, I started researching overall basic themes of the Quran. And there are many theories as to how the Quran is structured. For example, one theory focuses on ease of memorization for people who memorize the whole Quran. There is the ring or mirror theme, where the central meaning of the text is at the center, and the second half mirrors the first half. Or there are three ethical themes based on unity of God, narratives, and legal judgments. And then there are the Mecca and Medina themes, which refers to the verses that were sent down to Prophet Muhammad while he was in Mecca or Medina. And then, of course, there's numerous others. But for today, I've chosen to focus on the themes presented by 21st century scholar Fazlur Rahman. He wrote a book titled Major Themes of the Quran. He was the first scholar that I encountered that attempted to create an overarching theme of the Quran. And he outlined 7 major themes, the first being God, the second, humans, third, humans in society, then nature, prophethood and revelation, the end of time, and lastly, Satan and evil. So I want to take these themes and talk about its intended meaning and apply it to Surah Al-Fatiha, or the opening, which was the first chapter of the Quran. This chapter is said to open one's heart to faith in God and is believed to be a combination of the Quran's entire message and most important chapter. The chapter reads, verse 1, "In the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. All praise is due to God alone, the sustainer of the worlds. Most gracious, the dispenser of grace. Lord of the day of judgment, thee alone do we worship, and unto thee do we turn to for aid. Guide us the straight way, the way of those upon whom thou hast bestowed thy blessing, not of those who have been condemned by thee, nor of those who go astray." So taking the themes and applying it, the first theme is God. So this is the meaning applies to the verses of how everything in life is contingent upon God, the names of God, and God is the meaning of reality. So in Surah Al-Fatiha, the entire chapter reads about God, from the compassionate to the merciful to Lord of the worlds. The second theme is humankind. So the Quran speaks of God's creation. God has given us freedom of choice, general rules for humankind, who we are, why we are created and placed on earth. And Surah Al-Fatiha, the 5th verse, to thee we worship, and from thee we seek help, which shows us we are a creation of God. The third theme, humans in society, means God has given us guidance for this world, such as ethical and egalitarian approaches, our goals in life, responsibilities, and rights. And Surah Al-Fatiha emphasizes this point in the 6th verse, guide us upon the straight path, which specifies God can give us the guidance, and God has sent down the Quran as a guidance. The next theme is nature, so science, miracles described in the Quran, and I mentioned earlier the Big Bang Theory. And in the 2nd verse of Al-Fatiha, Lord of the worlds, is indicating that God is Lord of all spaces and therefore all that exists, no matter what the nature of existence may be. Next is Prophethood and Revelation, so the stories of the prophets, the revelations given to different prophets, the prophets' people. In the case of Prophet Muhammad, the Mecca and Medina revelations. And the 6th verse is guide us upon the straight path, referring to the prophets and people that followed. 6th is the end of time, meaning day of judgment, signs of the end of time, life after death, heaven and hell, what we need to know about immortality and consequences of how we live in this world. And the 4th verse says, God is the master of the day of judgment. And last is Satan evil, so the story of Satan, evil in the world, temptations. And the last verse of Surah Al-Fatiha, the path of those whom thou hast blessed, not of those who incur wrath, nor of those who are astray. which is implying evil in this world. Now, of course, a verse can fit into multiple themes, but while I'm reading the Quran, I like to keep these themes in mind. It helps me focus on the purpose of the verse and the purpose of the chapter and what God is trying to tell me. And this is how I tackle the complex and different Quran difficult Quran with very little classical Arabic understanding. And I do believe these themes aim to guide us and reinforce that the Quran does not seek to control every aspect of our life. It gives us a set of ideals, principles, and basic laws, and from there gives us freedom to live our lives according to reason, common sense, and our knowledge of the world. In chapter 3, verse 159, and it was by God's grace that thou, O prophet, didst deal gently with thy followers. For if thou hadst been harsh and hard of heart, they would have indeed broken away from thee. And while I'm advocating for taking charge of translating the Quran for yourself, I understand that a majority of the Muslim population has to rely on translations of the Quran, including myself. And no matter which translation you choose, you're ultimately reading it through someone else's filter. You are forced to read what they believe is the best understanding of that passage. People have interpreted and do interpret the Quran without an explicit or consistent methodology. And while this may seem limiting to connect directly with God, God has blessed some people with this knowledge and skill. And let us remember, no one scholar can ever grasp the full meaning of the Quran, since God is infinite, and so the Quran holds infinite meaning for all times and all people of all different backgrounds and levels of knowledge. So you have the option of going through Quranic translations in order to get the best understanding of any particular word or passage. And these translations will give you a solid understanding of the Quran. So when approaching the Quran, I suggest doing research in the person who has translated the Quran from Arabic into your native language. I suggest researching their academic credentials, their objectivity. Do they have any biases? Does this person have confidence in their Arabic? I personally recommend Muhammad Assad's translation of the Quran. I also recommend reading the scholar and Islamic studies professor, Dr. Ingrid Madsen's book, The Story of the Quran, where she addresses main issues with Quran interpretation and intellectual barriers. So even if we become classical Arabic scholars, there are still mysteries to the Quran that we will never know. For example, chapter 50, Surah Al-Kahf, the first verse is Kahf. Consider the sublime Quran, where the first word is the Arabic letter Kahf. And scholars are unsure about the significance of this letter. So let us remind ourselves that there will be mysteries to the Quran that we will never determine in our life. God is the creator of all things, including the ambiguity inherent in language. God must have intended all linguistically possible meanings. And sometimes the Quran is untranslatable. We can only do our best to understand it. And God reminds us of this in chapter 3, verse 3. It is God who has sent down the book to you. In it are definitive verses that are the foundation of the book, and others are ambiguous. So ultimately, we could have all the training and knowledge in the world, but if our hearts are hardened, deaf, or blind, with arrogance and closed to receiving God's guidance, we will never receive any guidance. Let us purify our intentions and ask God for guidance while reading the Quran, as God reminds us in chapter 19, verse 98. When you read the Quran, seek God's protection from Satan, the rejected one. And Qur'an-focused Islam places the Qur'an back at the center of Islam and rederives Islam from its principles and philosophies, leading to an extremely open-minded, spiritual, and tolerant form of Islam that thinks the best of everyone, that fits modern science, and remains fully part of mainstream Islam. And my Islam is Quran-centered because for me this leads to inspiration, creativity, and the feeling of acceptance, rather than obligation, which made me feel like Islam was unattainable. And I felt that I had no room to grow. And I like to think that my version of Islam is like the prophets. I am concerned with fighting injustice and tyranny, freeing people from oppression, and reconnecting with God as my guide. And at the Women's Mosque of America, we focus on Quran literacy and comprehension as a form of empowerment. So let us take hold of our own faith and read the words of God directly. Additionally, in the words of Dr. Ingrid Madison, we need to live our life in faith with community, in community with others, so they can help illuminate our flaws and support us in our spiritual growth. But our growth will be limited unless our communities reflect the diversity of human experience. So let us focus on the chapters that we have memorized or are trying to memorize and understand their meaning. Again, Dr. Ingrid Madison says embodiment theory facilitates a description of ongoing learning process that begins with Quranic memorization. And memorization is the base for recollection. It's the process of engraving the sacred verses onto the physiology of the person from childhood. And Sayyid Hussein Nas highlighted this point in the study Quran. Most Muslims are experiencing the Quran as the oral revelation that it is and was experienced by many of the companions who first heard it from the mouth of the Prophet. So let us recite a section of the Quran with full awareness of it as the word of God and to meditate upon it as one whose soul is being directly addressed, as the Prophet's soul was addressed during its revelation. And I would like to end with a Rumi poem. The interpretation of the sacred text is true if it stirs you to hope, activity, and awe. And if it makes you slack in your service, know the real truth to be this: it is a distortion of the sense of the saying and not a true interpretation. This saying has come down to inspire you to serve, that God may take the hands of those who have lost hope. Ask the meaning of the Quran from the Quran alone and from that one who has set fire to his idle fantasy and burned it away, and has become a sacrifice to the Quran, bowing low in humbleness, so that the Quran has become the essence of their spirit. The essential oil that has utterly devoted itself to the rose. You can smell either the oil or rose as you please. Thank you.